In the previous video, we looked at how to add a responsive panel tag helper to give us a nice fluid mobile experience. Now we're going to look at how to add a data grid tag helper to our application. The data grid has an extremely rich set of functionalities like paging, sorting, filtering. We can export the data to PDF and Excel. We can do all of our create, read, update, deletes from here. The grid supports virtualization, mobile, and it's accessible, so it has keyboard navigation and is Section 508 compliant and so on. So let's see how we can add this robust data grid tag helper to our project. So back in Visual Studio, I've got my project open and I'm going to navigate to our partial that has the view logic for our data grid. Now right now I've got some template data just sitting in there, and that's just a basic bootstrap grid right now. So let's run the application and see what this looks like. Again, we're building with a prototype and adding these tag helpers as we go along to add functionality and make this a real live working application. And there we have our prototype application, and here's where our bootstrap grid is right now. And we're going to replace this with the Telerik data grid tag helper. So let's break down our solution here. We are in the invoices grid partial, and we're going to add that tag helper in its place. So the first thing we need to do is get rid of this HTML that's taking up the space. And we're going to start by saying kendo. Let our IntelliSense help us out here. Say grid. And then we need to give the grid a name. So we'll give this a name of employee sales. And then I'm going to set an initial height for this data grid, just so it takes up the right amount of space. Now the next thing we need to do is look at our data source and see what kind of data we want to represent in the grid, because we need to fill out a schema for some of it and let the data grid know where that data is coming from. So in my invoice controller, I have an action that returns all of the data that I need for my data grid. Now we're going to do some custom filtering on this later, so these date and time and salesperson fields will come in handy. So I'm not going to explain those now, we'll do that in a later video. But what we need to see is this data source request attribute and the data source request object that's going to come back and tell this grid what page we're on, how it's being filtered, and so on. So we'll map that to a variable called request. And then when we return our results, we want to project that to a data source result. And this is going to tell the Telerik Kendo UI grid how to represent that data on the view side. So we'll go to our database. We'll select out the data that we need. And then we'll call to data source result and then project that back to our data source as JSON. That JSON will get populated into our data grid. So these are the fields, the invoice order ID, customer name, date, and so on that we're going to be adding to our data grid. So let's go ahead and add this information. So first we need to specify that we're going to have some columns. And we'll adjust this formatting here so it looks nice. And then we'll need to add a column to this set and specify the field. So we'll add customer name. And then we can set a meaningful title as well. And we'll set that as customer name. Now we can actually close off this tag helper because we don't need to add anything further to it. And then we'll just continue with the rest of our fields. So we'll need to add our order date. And in the case of our order date, I want to specify a format. We can do that in our tag helper as well. So this is how we can represent the type of date that we'd like to display, or the format we'd like to display it in. So we can say month, day, year. And again, I can add a meaningful title. I'll call this order date. And we'll just repeat this for our next field as well. Get this tag closed off proper. And then we can say column. And then we also had a product name. And I'll go ahead and paste some of this in so we don't have to type out each individual column on the video here. And I also want to make note of this minimum screen width attribute that I added. If the minimum screen width is 768 pixels or more, then display this column. Otherwise, we're going to hide the column because we're on a smaller device that can't support that many columns across. So we're going to hide some of the less meaningful columns on smaller devices. This is a way that we can further help along that responsive mobile style for the grid. Now, next we need to add a data source to the grid to tell it where we're going to get our data from. So I'll add that tag helper in. So we'll set the data source. And we'll close this tag off, and we'll add some more information here inside. What we need to do is tell the data source how this data is mapped, so we'll need a schema. And we only really need to do this for fields that are of numeric or date value. And we have one date value in here. So we'll go ahead and do a model with the field of order date, and we'll specify that this is a date type. Now for strings, this isn't very important. If we have things like integers, numeric values such as currency, then we definitely need to make sure we map those in our field. Now we need to tell the data source where the URL is to get this data from. So we'll add a transport tag in here. We'll tell it to read from this URL. And this is going to be url.action. The action is invoices. And the controller is the invoice controller. And now we can set all of the features that we'd like our grid to support by just adding additional tags and attributes here. We'll tell the data grid we'd like to enable grouping, sorting, paging. We can also set the page count information here. We'll set the additional refresh button here so we can click a nice refresh experience on the UI. And then we'll set filterable to true as well. Let's save this. And we'll let our application refresh. And where we had that placeholder before, we should now have a nice, robust data grid with lots of features like paging. We can page through these records. We can sort and filter. So we can sort just by clicking on the name, or we can add a custom filter using these nice UI components here. We can filter, we can say contains, let's add one of my favorites, something that contains beer. And there's all of our records that have beer in the name. We can also do things like group the records. Let's clear this filter. And we can just drag and drop to group these items. So we'll group by date. So we get a nice experience there where we can collapse and expand items by their group. We can even sort those groups here by clicking on the arrow up and down and so on. We can even add the ability to export these to PDF, Excel, and expand how the users can interact with the data that way. In the next video, I'll show you how to use client-side events. So we can wire up these custom filters. So we'll use our dates and our team members from the form here on the left to change how we represent our data in the grid here on the right. So thanks for joining me and learning about how to add tag helpers to your application using Telerik UI for ASP.NET Core.